Yo, how's it going? It's Chris. Real quick, wanted to show you how to dial in the VBIOS on the DELL G5 SE 5505 laptop. It has the AMD Radeon RX 5600M, but with the Satori Nori VBIOS, it switches it over to the 5600 XT, which permits curative editing and such things like that. Let's take a look at my latest VBIOS. Okay, so let's start off this is what has to be flashed. Let's start off right here at spread spectrum, which is zeroed out. This gives you an extra free 50 megahertz on the core clock because there's a delta with the spread spectrum, which I feel works better with it off. So I zeroed it out and it works, it's a little bit faster. And then let's move on down to you can also change something in SMC DPM info. You can change the MVDD ratio to 0 if you wanted to run ultra low voltage on the memory or achieve higher memory overclocks. But you have to be weary because the ratio changes the observable voltage. So I run 1 volt instead of 1.35 to yield for peak performance on the memory. That has to be flashable though. You have to flash the BIOS to get that because it's outside of the power play table. And then we go to the power play table, nothing to change here except for the shutdown temperature, 88 degrees Celsius. And then I switched the power savings clock mode max from 1750 to 1706. So it can run static at 1706. It doesn't fluctuate at all until it hits a temperature I'll show you later. Until it hits 66 degrees Celsius, then it'll fluctuate between 66 and 65, continuous, 65 degrees Celsius on the hotspot. So that's good. Then I switched over the peak frequency and overdrive to 1706 megahertz and 850 millivolts. I find to be a stable overclock, stable frequency to voltage ratio. And then I switched the minimum voltage from 800 to 675. That works just fine on like every card. Okay, and then moving along to infrastructure limits, I got the power limit set to 100 amps, 100 watts, and 100 amps, and I have the temperature limits all set to 83 degrees Celsius, all the way down to the PLX at the PCIe. Usually I go in here and set this temperature PLX here. I guess I'm gonna have to do that now. To make sure PLX is limited. Now let's go to voltage control. Took off the ULV offset of GFX. Set the minimum voltage ULV GFX to 675. Set the minimum voltage GFX to 675. And set the max voltage GFX of 850. And then I set the load line resistance to 255.996 milliohms, which I feel, and I have documented this with a power meter, it does reduce the power consumption just a little bit, a couple watts. It helps reduce temperatures. Okay, And then I zeroed out the slow curve for the GFX. And then I set the GFX frequency peak again to 1706 here in frequency tables. Frequency table GFX. Here's the voltage for the memory. If you set the NVDD ratio to 0, you would want to set the memory NVDD ratio to a maximum of 1000, but optimally 900, because it could overheat and shut down on you on the desktop. You have 1 volt without active airflow over the memory controller. Anyway, I don't even mess with that on the laptop. I just leave it stock. And then GFX CLK, this is how to get the clock to stay static. It'll idle at the it'll idle at 850 millivolts. But that's just fine because it's only 50 millivolts higher than stock idle. And I can operate at 1706 megahertz at 850 millivolts, which is pretty good. That's max on this laptop, basically, for an 80 degrees Celsius hotspot. But I have the GFX CLK thermal set to 66 high, 65 low, and then it'll fluctuate above 1000 megahertz after it hits 66 to 65 Celsius. This is for reliability. High limit on GFX CLK when temperature is high for reliability. Yeah, I like to do that for reliability purposes. Here, the fan, I mean, I don't think, none of it matters. I actually just cut the blue wire on the fans, both fans, the blue wire. No one does that, but that's what you gotta do on this laptop, or any laptop for that matter, if you don't want them overheating. Some people like to let their laptops run real hot. I, for one, do not like my laptop to run hot. So I cut the wire. Anyway, moving over to AVFS curve, I overrode it. GFX, I zeroed out the AVFS GB GFX. Left the SoC alone. Zeroed out the DFLL, which is the digital frequency lock loop curve. Zeroed it out. And then I set the DC tolerance GFX to 0 from 38. Set so there's no tolerance. It runs precisely at what I set it to run at, without any fluctuation, minimal fluctuation for that matter. And then first I set the DC, BTC, BIM, GFX, and Max GFX to 0, and then load it up with more power tool, write it, restart the driver, go into the curve. I'll show you in a second. At 0, it had to be at 0 for me to know what the new curve value needed to be. And then I looked at it with it at 0, the curve, and the curve reported 812 millivolts. So I took 850, my desired peak voltage, minus 812, which is the curve voltage at 0, DC, BTC, Bidmax, GFX. And I got a value of 38. So I put 38 in there, and now it runs perfect. I'll show you what that does in a second. And then everything else is cool here, except for this one. I set the DC, BTC, GB, AVFS voltage GFX to 0 there. And then I'll show you real quick in the tuning of what I'm talking about. I'll reset it just so you can see that this is default values. See how it idles precisely at 850 millivolts, and it operates precisely at 1706 megahertz and 850 millivolts. So yeah, this is a stable operational VBIOS here, and you can try out these settings. And this is just kind of like a tutorial for YAABE, and I hope you enjoy your overclocking adventures. Thank you very much. Goodbye.